Imagine a web of abductions, secret chambers, and unimaginable suffering. A story that seems like it came from the pages of a chilling thriller. But this is not fiction. It's the grim reality that unfolded in Belgium, shaking the very foundations of society and exposing the vulnerabilities that lurk beneath the surface. We are going to uncover the shocking details of Marc Dutroux's crimes, the lives he forever altered, and the investigation that unfolded. The Marc Dutroux case isn't just a story. It's a testament to the evil that exists in the world and the unwavering pursuit of justice. I'm Stephanie Moram, and this is Wicked Ever After. Need to give you a trigger warning. We're going to be talking about children, and we're going to be talking about SA. So if you cannot watch this, please go on to another video because it's a little bit graphic. Please consider clicking the thumbs up on this episode to help get the story out. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel or podcast, depending on where you're tuning in. I really do appreciate all the support that you offer. And I do have Invisalign, like I mentioned on all of my episodes. I do my best with my pronunciation, but sometimes I fumble, so please be kind with me. Marc Dutroux was born on November 6, 1956, in Brussels to parents Victor and Janine, who were both teachers. He had 4 siblings, creating a rather large and hectic household. Marc reported that there was a lot of violence in the home, saying his parents were frequently physically violent with him. After years of a crumbling marriage and after his parents got divorced in 1971, Marc left the house and never looked back. Without a place to go and a solid plan other than needing to separate himself from his parents, Marc became a drifter. According to numerous press reports, he was a gay sex worker. At 20 years old, he married his first wife and had 2 sons. Then his wife claimed that during their marriage, Marc was physically violent with her and he had numerous affairs. One of those affairs was with Michel Martin, a primary school teacher. Marc's first wife, sick of the cheating and violence, decided to divorce him, and they separated in the early 1980s. Unfazed by losing one wife, Marc married Michelle, and they later had 3 children together. Marc had a long record as a juvenile delinquent, and after being trained as an electrician in adulthood, he was often found unemployed. While he was married to his first wife, Marc did find some employment as a scrap dealer and supplemented his income by stealing car parts. He sounds like an awesome guy. During his marriage to Michelle, he committed petty offenses including assault, drug dealing, and trading stolen cars. He also acquired various land holdings with the money gained through his auto theft and sex work, seemingly unable to distance himself from a life of crime. He was also known to frequent ice skating rinks in Charleroi, where it was reported he deliberately ran into or tripped young female skaters so he could have an excuse to touch them. This was becoming such a pattern that in October of 1980, Marc got into a physical altercation with a male skater after repeatedly colliding with his girlfriend. Charges were filed and the boyfriend ended up serving time for assault, while Marc received a slap on the wrist and was only banned from the skating rink. Given his background and behavior towards young girls, it's no surprise that on December 14, 1985, Marc abducted a young woman named Axel D. But he did not do it alone. In later testimony, Axel said that Marc had an accomplice, Jean Van Peteghem, who had told Axel that he was part of a gang led by 2 gang leaders, an Italian and a crazy, stupid one. Jean, who lived with Marc after being discharged from the military and had a failed marriage, later confessed to helping Marc kidnap Axel and claimed that Michelle, Marc's wife, was in on it too. During his confession, Jean also told police that Axel was not their first victim and that they had also kidnapped 2 other girls. This was never confirmed, as sadly, these two victims were never located by authorities. On June 7th, 1985, Marc was at it again, and this time he kidnapped 11-year-old Sylvie D, and a few months later, on October 17th, 1985, took Maria V, a 19-year-old from Perron-les-Banches. Maria went on to later claim that there was a third man involved, but he was never found, and not much was known about who that could possibly be. This pattern continued into 1986, when a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old female were both kidnapped by Marc. Both reported various people were present, meaning that Marc had a lot of help, perhaps lending credibility to Jean's comments about being part of a gang. Elizabeth, the 15-year-old, told investigators that Marc would videotape her naked and took several photos of her naked body during the time she spent in his captivity. It wasn't until February 1987 that Marc, Jean, and Michel were arrested. Fortunately for the victims, their arrest largely came due to the fact that Jean had a big mouth and gave a lot of information about himself when he was talking to the female victims. This allowed police to identify Jean and Marc much quicker than they probably normally would have. In April of 1989, the three were convicted of SA, receiving different lengths of sentencing. Marc was to serve 13.5 years, Jean 6.5 years, and Michel received 5 years. Marc received a harsher sentence because he was also being charged with several robberies, with Jean including a brutal robbery of a 15-year-old woman. While in jail, Marc convinced a health professional that he was disabled due to mental illnesses, allowing him to collect public assistance of $1,200 a month from the Belgian government. I need you to remember that for further down our story. He also convinced him that he needed sedatives for sleeping problems, sedatives that he later used to sedate his victims. This really shows the power of Marc's ability to manipulate and charm other people in order to get what he wanted, a quality we often see in serial killers. Against the advice of both the public prosecutor and the psychiatrist who had examined Marc in prison and named him dangerous, Marc was granted early release and set free after only serving 3 years of his 13.5-year sentence. That is messed up, in my opinion. Marc, now a free man with an appetite for kidnapping, was only out a couple of years before he kidnapped 8-year-old classmates Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau on June 24th, 1995. During his 2-year sabbatical, Marc had been preparing for his future kidnapping and carefully planned out every detail. He constructed a cement dungeon for his victims, measuring only 2.5 meters and 99 centimeters. There was a dirty bed, concrete walls, and a door that was hidden behind drywall and shelving, making it almost impossible for anyone to know that it was there. This real-life prison of nightmares was where he kept Julie and Melissa. During their time there, he repeatedly SA'd them and entertained himself by producing and recording the violence. 2 months later, on August 23rd, Marc and an accomplice by the name of Michel Lelivre were at it again, this time abducting 2 females, 17-year-old Anne Marchel and 19-year-old Angèle Labranche, who went missing on a short trip they took together. Because the dungeon was already occupied, Marc kept Anne and Angèle chained to a bedroom inside the house. They were tortured, SA'd, and eventually killed. Police didn't pay too much attention to the family's reports that Anne and Angèle were missing. Instead, authorities tried to claim they were probably out partying and would return home at some point. The families were left with very little help and had to hang flyers and form their own search parties, hoping to find their missing daughters. After a few weeks, efforts fizzled out, and with each passing day, those who loved them started to lose hope. Around this time, Marc's mother wrote a letter to the police stating that she knew that Marc had kidnapped 2 girls and was keeping them at his house. The police disregarded this letter. Marc was arrested in November 1995 because he was involved in the theft of a van and other suspicious activities. Because police were still searching for Julie and Melissa, the 8-year-old girls, they conducted a search at Marc's house. And you might be wondering, why did I not mention the other two girls? It's because the police did not think that their disappearances were actually connected. One of the searches of Marc's home was on December 13th and the other was on December 19th. The head officer that conducted the search was there with a locksmith, and during their search, the locksmith heard children voices coming from behind the walls. The voices we now know were Julie and Melissa. The locksmith informed the officer in charge, swearing he heard the voices, but the officer disregarded him and told him it was a mistake and to move on. No one ever bothered to investigate the walls or look behind the shelf that was placed in front of the door. Later, this officer claimed that the shelf looked like just a regular shelf and had so much clutter on it that it didn't make sense to take everything off the shelf and see if there was anything behind it. During the same searches, there was no sign of the girls, but they did recover several home videotapes. In these tapes, you can see Marc constructing his dungeon and placing items on the shelf over the door. This was the evidence the police needed to find Julie and Melissa and arrest Marc. However, in a suspicious twist, the officers claimed they didn't have a VCR or something, so couldn't actually watch the tapes, so they seized them but didn't watch them, which is really weird in my opinion. It seemed the officer really botched the opportunity to save Julie and Melissa. Still, authorities didn't agree since the same officer was later promoted, adding fuel to an already outraged public. So, when Marc was in prison after the theft of the van, he instructed his wife Michelle to feed the dogs and the girls Julie and Melissa. Michelle neglected to feed them. She claimed she was too scared to enter the dungeon, so without anyone to watch after them, both Julie and Melissa ended up starving to death. To this day, it's unclear how long they survived after Marc went to prison, since various stories have been told. Initially, Marc said they were still alive when he was released on March 20th, 1996, 3 months after his arrest. According to him, Julie died the day he arrived home and Melissa died only 4 days later. However, later during his trial, he said both girls were dead when he returned home. An expert claims that the girls wouldn't have been able to survive the entire time he was in prison with the little amount of food and water that was left for them. On August 9th, 1996, 14-year-old Alecia was walking home from a local swimming pool in Belgium when she was kidnapped by Marc and Michelle and thrown into the van. And I mean Michelle, his accomplice, not his wife. Upon entering the home, Alecia was led to a dungeon, only to discover she was not alone. Another girl was already there, Sabine Dardenne, who was taken 3 months earlier. 12-year-old Sabine was biking to school on May 28th, 1996, when she was ripped off her bike, thrown into the same white van, and locked in her new concrete hell. For 3 months, she was without sunshine and without any contact with anyone but Marc until Alecia arrived. Sabine was told to write letters to her parents. Marc claimed he was holding her for ransom and that they refused to pay, making her believe she was unloved, uncared for, and forced to be locked away as punishment. That is horrible, and I feel so bad for this little girl. She wrote letter after letter thinking she was communicating with her parents, when in reality, Marc took the letters upstairs, read them for his own enjoyment, and burned them. He starved her, making her go days without food, and then ate her repeatedly. The day Alecia arrived, there was no solace, as she too would just become another pawn in Marc's sick mind. But with the days passing and hope fleeting, the girls were about to catch a break. It's interesting to note here what a psychiatrist later said about why Marc likely kidnapped girls that range so much in age. Since this is different than most serial killers who preferred victims around the same age. He stated that the 8-year-old girls were too young and didn't arouse him. But Angève and Anne, who are older teenagers and seem to be around the preferred age, but they put up too much of a fight, and it made it too difficult for Marc. This is why he moved on to Sabine and Alecia, thinking they would be more sexually satisfying due to their age, but unable to fight him off. This is so messed up. During the investigation into the missing girls, an eyewitness reported seeing a white van in the neighborhood where Alecia was taken. He noticed it because it had been patrolling the neighborhood, and he didn't recognize the men inside. Suspicious enough, he happened to get 3 letters from the license plate, thank goodness, and was able to give them to investigators a few days after the kidnapping. Armed with crucial information, investigators matched the van to the one and only Marc Dutroux. Police raided all of Marc's properties and on August 13th arrested him, his wife Michelle, and his accomplice Michelle. An initial search of Marc's home proved inconclusive and not much was found, but 2 days later, Marc and Michelle both confessed. On August 15th, 1996, Marc led authorities to the dungeon where police found Sabine and Alecia alive. The girls were rescued and reunited with their families, and the horrifying nightmare was over and their path to recovery was just beginning. A few days later, on August 17th, 1996, after Marc told police where to find Melissa and Julie, the police were really hoping to find the girls alive. But unfortunately, the authorities located their bodies stuffed in a bag. They also found Bernard's remains, one of his accomplices. Bernard was, like I mentioned, his accomplice, who he killed right before he was arrested for the car theft. All the bodies were found in Marc's backyard. I just really can't imagine how the parents must have felt, where 2 girls were saved, but their 2 daughters were not. Marc denied killing the girls and blamed his wife, Michelle, because she didn't feed them. Marc admitted that he abducted 2 other girls. On September 3rd, 1996, the bodies of Anne and Angèle were exhumed. Upon examination, it was determined that both girls had been drugged and buried alive, suffering before their death. A further search of Marc's properties turned up hundreds of commercial adult child videos, along with many homemade sex tapes that he had made with Michelle. This is on top of the videos that had already been seized by the police and never watched. After Marc's arrest, there was a public outrage. There appeared to be too many missed opportunities from investigators, and many strange coincidences happened during the years before the trial that some people were starting to think something bigger was at play. For starters, they had missed their chance to save Julie and Melissa's life because they ignored the locksmith's reports about hearing child voices. They'd also seemingly chalked up Marc's mom's letter about him having young girls in his basement as nonsense. In October of 1996, Judge Jean-Marc Canirat was removed from the investigation by the Supreme Court. They were concerned about his impartiality after he attended a fundraising dinner for the victims' families. Another judge later resigned after his close relationship with a powerful businessman named Michel Nilou came to light. In 1998, on April 23rd, Marc was allowed to view his case files. He was accompanied by 2 police officers, but somehow Marc escaped when one of the officers went on break. He was captured a few hours later, but the Minister of Justice, the Minister of the Interior, and the police chief all resigned because of his escape. In 2000, Marc received a 5-year sentence for threatening a police officer during his escape. Along with all of this, there was also countless hairs found in the dungeon where the girls were held. But a judge refused to have them tested for DNA, even though the lead investigator begged to have them analyzed in order to know whether more people besides Marc were involved. You would think that they would want all this DNA tested. This is ridiculous. The general prosecutor claimed that all hairs were tested, but the lead investigator claimed that they were in fact not. So who really knows? During the trial, Marc's lawyer said, "I speak not only as a lawyer, but as a citizen and father. He was not the only devil. Out of the 6,000 hair samples that were found in the basement cellar, where some of the victims were held, 25 unknown DNA profiles were discovered. There were people in that cellar that are not now accused." The prosecution never attempted to match those DNA profiles to people implicated in the case. 7 members of law enforcement were arrested for having ties to Marc. One was named Georges Zicot, who was a police detective and believed to be a known associate of Marc. He was charged with truck theft, document forgery, and insurance fraud. But perhaps the biggest outcry from the public came when Marc told police that he worked for a child pedo network that included high-ranking members of the Belgium establishment. The people believed a widespread cover-up was happening during this investigation to protect those in power. Remember when Judge Jean-Marc was removed from the case after attending the dinner with the victims' families? Well, more than 300,000 Belgians marched through the streets of Brussels. Protesters claimed that the judge was on the verge of publicly disclosing the names of high-level government officials who had been recognized in the videotapes that were seized at Marc's home. The judge said that the businessman Michel Nihoux, who had ties with the other judge who resigned from the case, was the brains behind the child kidnapping operation. Investigators also believed that Marc and Michel Nihoux were planning on a long-distance trafficking network involving cars and the import of girls, though no official evidence of this was ever uncovered. Marc wasn't the only one who was supporting the narrative that he worked for a child pedo ring. His accomplice, Michel, said that Julie and Melissa were kidnapped as an order by a third party. Unfortunately, once Michel was arrested, he stopped cooperating with authorities. Therefore, they could not gather any more information. He told police that he had been threatened and could not risk anything. The focus was then placed on Marc's large material wealth. At that time, he owned 10 homes and he was worth 6 million Belgian francs. While all of his wealth was tied up in property, he still received that public assistance of $1,200 a month that I mentioned at the very beginning from his stint in prison. Documents show that large sums of money in different currencies were deposited into his wife Michelle's bank account around the time of the kidnapping. The money transfers and the value in real estate made authorities think that this could be evidence a larger child pedo and sex worker ring was financing him. Some weight was given to the pedo ring theory by the so-called X-Files. These were interviews with witnesses who had come forward after the judge Jean-Marc had appealed for information from the public or from anyone who might know something. Witness X1, Régine Luff, talked about different parties that businessman Michel Nihoux had for high-level officials. At these parties, girls were forced into sex work, paraded around for the picking, and sometimes even murdered. She claimed to have been present at several unsolved murders of girls in the 1980s and pointed to Marc and Michel Nihoux as culprits. Unfortunately, these interviews were criticized as they believed the officer who was conducting the interviews was leading the witnesses. Other witnesses in the X-Files talked about different times when children were chased through the woods with Dobermans. Allegedly, there were gatherings that involved sex with minors, torture, and murder, and this all sounds so horrible. Since then, 3 journalists wrote a book called The X-Files, What Belgium Was Not Supposed to Know About the Dutroux affair. In his book, the author claimed that the ex-witnesses were much more believable than stated by the media. It also claimed that there had been substantial efforts by senior police officers to demolish the testimony of the ex-witnesses. One of those journalists, Alecia claimed that more than 20 potential witnesses had died in mysterious circumstances. One individual was found dead after they claimed to have knowledge of the van that was used by Marc in the kidnappings. Initial reports ruled his death a heart attack, but later it was determined he had been poisoned. His wife swore to find her husband's killer, and she was also found dead after her mattress had been set on fire. Jean-Paul Temillot was a member of the underground criminal world who disappeared the day he was supposed to talk to the police. Parts of his body were fished out of the canal on the day of Marc's arrest. These are just a few of the witnesses who have been killed or disappeared before being able to give any information to the authorities. This has obviously done nothing to tame suspicions that higher authorities were directing Marc and that something more sinister was happening in the undercurrent of Belgium society. 7.5 years after being arrested, Marc finally stood trial. The trial began on March 1st, 2004. Marc pled guilty to the murder of his accomplice Bernard, but denied kidnapping Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau and killing Anne Marchot and Égève la Bronx. He kept repeating it wasn't his fault that the 2 girls died because he was in jail at the time. Prosecutors claim that the reason it took so long for this trial to start was because they were too busy chasing stories about child pedo rings among high-ranking officials. Several of the victims' families boycotted the trial, stating that it was a circus and there had been no real progress in the case since the removal of the judge. It was a trial by jury, and a staggering 450 people were called to testify. Marc was being tried for the murders of Anne, Angèle, and Bernard. He was also being charged with other crimes including auto theft, kidnapping, attempted murder, attempted kidnapping, and SA. His wife Michelle, his accomplice Michel Lelivre, and Michel Nihoul were tried as accomplices to Marc's crimes. Because of the public outcry and threats, the accused were made to sit in a glass cage during the trial for their own protection. Sabine and Alecia were both present during the trial, sitting just feet away from the monster that kidnapped them and SA'd them. For privacy reasons, Marc's face was banned from being printed in the Belgium newspapers, and this ban remained in place for several weeks. I would have plastered his face all over everything. What a monster. During Marc's testimony, he maintained he was the low dog in the powerful pedo network. He also continued to claim that Michel Nihoul was the organizer of their kidnapping. Marc admitted to some kidnappings, but he denied being a murderer, although he did confess to killing Bernard. To the jury, he admitted he tortured and SA'd all the girls, but denied killing them until the very end. He just denied everything, this guy. For the duration of the testimony, he denied the kidnapping, SA, and murder of Julie and Melissa. He said he kept them locked in the home because he had to protect them from a powerful and sinister child sex ring. Okay, Marc, we all believe you. We all believe that's what you did. When it came to killing his helper, Bernard, Marc claimed that he buried him alive because he let the girls die. He also claimed that 2 unidentified officers had taken part with him in kidnapping of Anne and Angèle. At one point, he even said, "I wanted to create a hiding place to spare them from being sent to a sex worker ring." Liar. He went on to state that he had SA'd Angèle, while Bernard had SA'd Anne, but he did admit to drugging both of them. As for Michelle, Marc's wife, she stuck with her story, that she had allowed Julie and Melissa to starve because she was too scared to go down into the dungeon. She confirmed Marc's confession of killing Bernard and the kidnappings that took place. 3 months into the trial, on June 14th, 2004, the jury deliberated, and after 3 days, they had made their final decision. Marc, his wife Michelle, and Michel Lelivre were all found guilty on all charges. But in an interesting twist of fate, the jury was unable to reach a verdict on Michel Nihoul's role, further sparking the theory that he was, in fact, protected by high-ranking officials. The death penalty was abolished in Belgium in 1996, but most Belgians at the time would have had no issue with Marc receiving the death penalty. On June 22, 2004, Marc received the maximum life sentence in prison, while his wife, Michelle, received 30 years and Michel Lelivre got 25 years. The jury had been asked to go back and deliberate on whether Michel Nihoul was an accomplice, but was acquitted of the kidnapping and conspiracy charges. However, he was convicted of drug-related charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was released in 2006. He later died in October of 2019. A week after being charged, Marc appealed to sentencing. It went nowhere. No one wants you out, Marc. You're not getting out of jail. On August 19th, 2012, there was a possibility Michelle, Marc's wife, would be released early from prison. Around 2,000 people showed up to demonstrate in Brussels. Since then, she has been paroled, serving only 16 of her 30 years she was sentenced. She was released into the care of the Poor Clare in Melun and given shelter. She is not a nun nor part of the community, and the sisters have declared that they are not her guardians, but shelter was given under the condition that she would not violate the conditions of her parole. Since then, the convent has been sold, and she was forced to find a new shelter or she'd be ordered back to prison. A former judge in the region had created an apartment in his converted farmhouse where she lives now. I find that a little bit weird, like that she's living with a judge. Is that just me? It's a little bit weird. A few months after Michel was released, Marc requested the court in Brussels to allow him early release as well, insisting that he was no longer dangerous. Okay, Marc. He wanted to be released into house arrest with an ankle bracelet. 2 weeks later, the court denied his request. I mean, obviously. Therefore, he remains in solitary confinement in prison. In October of 2019, Marc did win the pre-parole right to a psychiatric assessment, which was supposed to take place in May 2020, but was then delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The assessment was eventually done the following year, and the summary was that Marc remains a great danger to society. 3 psychiatrists compiled the 19-page report labeled Marc as a sadistic psychopath who has no remorse for his many victims. Due to this and the fact he poses a high risk of reoffending, they recommended that no parole be given. Thank goodness. To this day, Marc's case is so infamous that between 1996 and 1998, more than 1/3 of Belgians with the surname Dutroux have applied to have their surname changed, wanting zero affiliation with this monster, and I do not blame them. While there is still so much speculation and suspicion surrounding this case, we know that these beautiful girls lost their lives at the hands of a true monster. We cannot truly understand what is going on in a psychopath's mind, and we will never be able to wrap our heads around why some girls are chosen to have this fate and others are not. But we can help their grieving families keep their names and memories alive. We can share their smiles, their stories, and hope that in some small way we have helped their spirit live longer than they actually did. In the comments, let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case. Also, don't forget to share your case suggestions so I know what you want to hear about next. Please hit the subscribe button on YouTube or whatever podcasting platform you're listening on. You can stay connected with me on Instagram and TikTok at This Is Stephanie Moram. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe out there.